The sun rises over the quiet, manicured lawns of Bellevue, Idaho on September 20th, 2003, and for a moment, the world is perfect. The kind of perfect that exists only in postcards and magazine spreads, in the hushed, whispering lives of the ultra-privileged. This is the realm of Alan and Diane Johnson. He, a successful businessman, a man who had built an empire from the ground up, a testament to the American dream made manifest. She, a woman of grace and poise, the elegant matriarch who curated their home, their social calendar, their very public image of success. Their lives were a flawless tableau, a carefully constructed monument to all that money could buy, a sprawling, beautiful home, a close-knit community, and the two children who were the perfect final strokes on their masterpiece. The son, an earnest, good-natured young man forging his own path, and the daughter, Sarah, a 16-year-old girl with a bright future, a life of endless possibility laid out before her. They were the Johnsons, and they had it all, or so it seemed. He knows that perfection is a flimsy facade, a thin veil drawn over the seething, chaotic undercurrents of the human heart. The cracks in the Johnson family's perfect wall began with a secret, a teenage secret as old as time, yet uniquely volatile in this particular crucible of wealth and expectation. It was a romance with a boy named Bruno Santos, a 19-year-old high school dropout and undocumented Mexican immigrant. For Sarah, Bruno was a lifeline, an escape from the suffocating perfection of her parents' world, a world where every move was a calculation and every choice a reflection on the family name. Their relationship was a rebellion, a silent screaming against the confines of her gilded cage. For Alan and Diane, it was an abomination. Not just a forbidden love, but a stain on their carefully cultivated reputation. It was a threat to their daughter's future, a betrayal of their values, a source of conflict that escalated from hushed arguments to bitter, screaming matches. The family's elegant home, once a sanctuary of quiet luxury, became a battleground. The final, fatal confrontation came on the eve of September 2nd. Alan and Diane had made a decision. They would go to the police and have Bruno deported. They would tear out the rot at its source, no matter the cost to their daughter's heart. They believed this was a necessary act of protection. The sleepless historian knows it was an act of war, the final declaration in a conflict that would end with two bodies and one life shattered forever. That morning, as the sun began its ascent, the tranquility of the Johnson home was shattered, not by a scream, but by the dull, flat reports of a rifle. The first shot. The sleepless historian pictures Diane, sleeping peacefully, her dreams of a perfect life coming to a horrifying end as a bullet tears through her skull. The quiet is broken by the sound of death, a sound so alien to this home of quiet comforts. The second shot, Alan, in the bathroom, hearing the first shot and the panicked silence that followed, he emerges and is met with the cold, unyielding reality of a rifle barrel. He is shot twice, a double tap to the chest, right above the heart. A man who built an empire, who controlled everything, is rendered powerless in an instant. The water from the shower continues to run, a meaningless, mundane sound in the wake of such savagery. And then the silence returns. A different kind of silence. The silence of an empty house, of still bodies, of secrets and death. The narrative of Sarah Johnson, the sole survivor, begins here. She runs from the house in a frantic, wild-eyed panic. She beats on the doors of her neighbors, her voice a thin, reedy wail in the morning air, pleading for help. The neighbors, accustomed to a quiet, serene Johnson family, are baffled, horrified. The 911 call is placed, and the machinery of law enforcement begins to grind into motion. But from the very first moments, a disquieting dissonance emerges. Sarah's story is not a single coherent tale. It is a constellation of contradictions, a series of narratives that shift and morph with each retelling. Was she in her room when she heard the first shot? Did she hear an argument before the gunshots? Did she go to her parents' door, or did she flee immediately? The investigators, seasoned and wary, hear the subtle shifts, the hesitations, the desperate attempts to craft a story that fits the facts, but which never quite aligns. They see a young girl who is too calm, too collected for a survivor of such a gruesome scene. A girl with a history of depression and a recent suicide attempt. A girl with a fierce, possessive love for a man her parents wanted to destroy. The suspicion, an unwelcome shadow, falls over her. The house, once a symbol of the Johnsons' success, becomes a crime scene, a canvas of blood and horror. But it is not the scene of the crime that holds the most damning secrets. It is the mundane, domestic clutter. In Sarah's bedroom, investigators find a leather glove, a mate to one usually kept in Diane's SUV. Next to a garbage can outside, ready for collection, they find the other glove, along with a pink bathrobe, Sarah's bathrobe, and a latex glove. The robe is soaked with the blood and brain matter of her parents. The gloves bear her DNA and traces of gunshot residue. Paint chips on the robe match the shirt she was wearing. It is a silent, grotesque self-portrait of a killer. The prosecution's theory is a masterpiece of forensic storytelling. They argue that Sarah, knowing her parents' final ultimatum, snapped. She armed herself with the .264 rifle, which belonged to the guest house tenant, and to which she had easy access. She wore a glove on her dominant hand and the robe backwards to protect herself from the backspray of blood and gore, a chillingly pragmatic act in the midst of a crime of passion. After the murders, she discarded the incriminating evidence, the robe and the gloves in the garbage can, thinking they would be whisked away by the morning's collection, a perfect final act of erasure. The defense, however, paints a different picture. They seize upon the inconsistencies, the ambiguities, the things that don't quite fit. There are no fingerprints from Sarah on the rifle. There is no blood on her body or the clothes she was wearing when the police arrived. The defense posits a chilling alternative, a mysterious third party, the real killer who wore the robe and gloves and somehow framed the girl. They point to the unidentified DNA and fingerprints on the gun, a specter of another killer, an unseen hand that pulled the trigger. The trial becomes a battle of narratives, a clash between the story of the angry, jilted daughter and the story of the shadowy, unknown assassin. The jury, a microcosm of society, must choose which truth to believe. They weigh the evidence, the changing stories, the bloody robe, the discarded gloves, the lack of blood on Sarah herself. The prosecution's argument, though it requires a leap of faith to explain the lack of blood, is grounded in the damning physical evidence tied directly to the accused. The defense's argument, while plausible, is built on an absence, a phantom killer. Ultimately, they choose the story with a face, the story of Sarah Johnson. They find her guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing is a grim denouement. The judge, faced with a girl who was 16 at the time of the murders, must make a choice that will seal her fate forever. Sarah is sentenced to 2 concurrent fixed life sentences without the possibility of parole, a punishment typically reserved for the most irredeemable of criminals. The sentence sends a ripple through the legal world as a child is condemned to die in prison. The post-conviction years are a testament to the ongoing saga. Appeals are filed, arguing ineffective counsel, new technology for DNA analysis, and the unconstitutionality of a life sentence for a juvenile. Each appeal is a plea to re-examine the past, to find the truth in the shadows of a case that has never fully let go of its mysteries. But each time, the courts uphold the conviction. The narrative is set. The verdict, once delivered, is unyielding. He looks at the case not as a simple true crime story, but as a parable of privilege, of family dysfunction, of the hidden violence that can erupt from the most mundane of conflicts. It is a story of a daughter's desperate, misguided love, a family's rigid control, and the tragic consequences when those two forces collide. It is a reminder that the quiet, perfect surface of a beautiful life can hide the most monstrous of truths. Sarah Johnson's story is the story of a girl who had everything, but who felt she had nothing. A girl whose secret was so explosive it tore her world and the lives of her parents apart, leaving behind a legacy of blood, sorrow, and an endless stream of unanswerable questions. The question of her guilt is settled in the eyes of the law, but in the court of public opinion and in the restless mind of the sleepless historian, the ghosts of Alan and Diane Johnson continue to wander, and the case of their daughter Sarah remains an open wound, a testament to the fact that even in the brightest sunshine, the darkest shadows can exist. Case 3. Kristen Margrave. Rossum was by all accounts a golden girl, the daughter of a university president. She moved through life with the polished confidence of the privileged, her intelligence matched only by her striking beauty. She graduated summa cum laude with a degree in chemistry from San Diego State University, a testament to a mind built for order and precision. She was, in the words of a family friend, a young woman with everything to live for. Her career at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office as a toxicologist seemed a perfect fit, a role where her gifts for analysis and scientific truth could be put to use in the service of justice. She was the final critical piece of the puzzle, the one who could peer into the silent body and read the chemical confession left behind. But the sleepless historian knows that every fairy tale has a secret. Kristen's began with a youthful flirtation with methamphetamine, a habit she claimed to have left behind. But the siren call of addiction is a patient predator, and it came back for her in the sterile, air-conditioned world of the coroner's office. This was her first betrayal, a violation of her professional oath. The second was a more intimate one, an affair with her married boss, a charismatic Australian named Michael Robertson. This was not a whirlwind romance, but a quiet conspiratorial codependency, a shared addiction to deceit and to the powerful lethal drugs they were entrusted to control. The sleepless historian knows that it is in these moments of small incremental betrayals that the great catastrophic ones are born. The truth of her double life was an unseen cancer, and its first victim was her husband, Gregory DeVillers. Greg was a man in love with the lie. He saw the beautiful, brilliant wife, the woman who had captivated him since college, not the soul in a free-fall. As the cancer of her secrets spread, Greg, in a final desperate act of love and rage, presented her with an ultimatum: confess your affair and your drug use, or I will expose you to your bosses. It was not a threat, it was an act of war, a declaration from a man who wanted his wife back, a man who refused to be complicit in her lies. And Kristen, a woman whose entire existence was built on preserving a beautiful fiction, had no choice but to tear down the reality that threatened to expose her. Act 2. A suicide staged. The final act of this tragedy unfolded on November 6, 2000. Kristen's story, told with practiced tearful precision, was one of a tragic suicide. Greg, despondent over their failing marriage, had taken his own life. The rose petals, those fragile, poignant symbols of a twisted romance, were an afterthought, a clumsy cinematic gesture borrowed from a film, a desperate attempt to frame the cold, surgical murder as a theatrical suicide. The sleepless historian, in its ceaseless vigil, sees the irony. A toxicologist, a woman who understood the silent, devastating language of poison, was undone not by her science, but by the one tiny detail that screamed of artifice. The scene, as recounted in court, was a study in grotesque detail. Kristen claimed to have gone to work that morning, leaving a sluggish, drugged-up Greg at home. She said she returned home for a short time around noon, finding him still sleeping. The prosecution, however, produced a Vaughn's receipt time-stamped at 12:42 p.m., showing the purchase of a single red rose. It was a silent, unyielding witness to her lie. She claimed to have found him later that evening, not breathing, and called 911. The 911 tape, a chilling piece of evidence, played her hysterical sobs, a jarring counterpoint to her later serene composure with paramedics. The paramedics, upon arrival, found the body in a scene so unsettling it immediately raised alarms. A man, dead, covered in rose petals, his mouth rimmed with the fine powder of an unknown substance. The staging was too perfect, too theatrical, a performance that a trained professional would immediately see for the cheap artifice it was. The sleepless historian understands the psychology of such a moment. The killer, in a desperate attempt to control the narrative, often leaves behind a signature, an unspoken confession. Kristen, a woman who was a master of the invisible killer, was an amateur at the art of the lie. The detectives, seasoned and wary, saw through the theatrical staging, and from that moment on, the story of a tragic suicide began its slow, inevitable unraveling. Act 3. The Unyielding Truth. The investigation that followed was a methodical, painstaking descent into Kristen's world. The detectives, Dan McLaughlin and Mark Schreiber, began by picking at the threads of her story. They learned of the affair, the drug abuse, and the missing drugs from the medical examiner's office. The missing fentanyl, a powerful opiate, was the key. She had logged it in, she had access to it, and it was the very drug that killed her husband. The autopsy, outsourced to an independent lab to avoid a conflict of interest, revealed a concentration of fentanyl in Greg's system that was 7 times the lethal dose. The prosecution's theory was clear. She had poisoned him, possibly after a failed attempt with another drug, clonazepam, which was also found in his system. The defense, in a baffling strategic move, conceded that Greg had died from fentanyl poisoning. Their argument, however, was that he had taken the drug himself in a desperate act of suicide. The prosecution demolished this theory. Greg was a physically fit, successful man who hated drugs. His brother testified that a suicide was unimaginable. Furthermore, medical experts testified that a man with that level of fentanyl in his system would have been unconscious and incapable of scattering rose petals across his own body. The high concentration of fentanyl, the experts argued, was more consistent with an acute poisoning, not a slow, self-administered overdose. The presence of a significant amount of urine in his bladder also suggested a death that was not immediate, a death that came after hours of unconsciousness, a detail that contradicted Kristen's account of finding him suddenly lifeless. The most damning evidence, however, was not scientific but personal. It was the testimony of Kristen's own colleagues, the subtle shifts in her stories, her too calm demeanor, and the discovery of the Vaughn's receipt. The prosecution argued that she, in a chilling act of cold, calculated murder, had administered the poison and then meticulously staged the scene to appear as a tragic overdose. They painted a portrait of a woman who chose to destroy the man who loved her rather than face the consequences of her actions. The jury, faced with a choice between a story of tragic suicide and a story of terrifying premeditated evil, chose the latter. The sleepless historian knows that in the court of public opinion, the truth is often a matter of which story is more compelling. In the case of Kristen Rossum, the narrative of the beautiful, brilliant, and utterly ruthless killer was too potent to be denied. Act 4. The Unyielding Sentence. On December 12, 2002, the verdict was delivered. Kristen Rossum was found guilty of first-degree murder with a special circumstance of poison. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A woman who had once been a symbol of perfection was now a permanent resident in a world of concrete and steel, a final irony for a person whose life was a series of carefully constructed cages. The sleepless historian sees her father, a man of academia and reason, left to grapple with the terrifying truth of his daughter's actions. He, like Greg, had believed in her, had seen the promise and the genius, and he, like Greg, was ultimately left with a betrayal that was both intimate and incomprehensible. In the years that followed, the civil lawsuit brought by Greg's family was not about money, but about a public legal declaration that Greg was not a suicide victim, but a murdered man. The family was awarded a staggering punitive damages award of over $100 million, a gesture from the courts that acknowledged the deep, unpayable debt owed to a life that had been so cruelly taken. The story of Kristen Rossum became a cautionary tale, a grim parable for a society that had placed its trust in a woman who used the very tools of justice as instruments of a private, unimaginable cruelty. The appeals that followed were a testament to the legal system's long memory. Rossum's new counsel argued that her original trial attorney was ineffective for conceding that fentanyl was the cause of death without first testing the samples for metabolites, a scientific detail that could have proven the drug was added after Greg's death. For a time, it seemed as if a glimmer of hope might exist, but the appeals were ultimately denied. The narrative was set. The verdict, once delivered, was unyielding. In its restless vigil, sees in her not just a murderer, but a tragic reflection of a brilliant mind twisted by a fatal flaw, a woman whose genius was the very key to her own damnation. And in the silence of her prison cell, the ghosts of her past, the lingering scent of roses, and the silent scream of a life cut short continue to haunt her, a final, unyielding testament to the fact that even the most carefully constructed lies will in the end be unmasked by the merciless truths of history. Her story is a grim reminder that the most lethal poisons are not always found in a lab, but can fester in the darkest corners of the human heart, and once released, can destroy not only a life, but a very soul. The case of Kristen Rossum remains an open wound in the collective memory, a haunting echo of a beautiful lie that was undone by a single perfect rose. Case 3. A city is more than its streets and buildings. It is a living chronicle of its people, its triumphs and its tragedies. For Liverpool, the year 2022 was not a year of simple history, but a year of blood, a year where a dark, unseen current of gang violence rose to the surface, claiming the lives of the innocent. In the span of a few short months, the city was rocked by a trifecta of senseless killings that shattered the illusion of safety, a grim procession that began with Ashley Dale, continued with Olivia Pratt Corbel, and culminated on Christmas Eve with a young beautician named Elle Edwards. The sleepless historian sees these cases not as isolated incidents, but as a single, horrific story of a city under siege, a story of reckless malevolence and a final, unyielding justice. Act 1. The unspoken war. In the murky world of gangland Liverpool, an unspoken war had been festering for years, a simmering cauldron of slights, feuds, and reprisals that rarely touched the world of the law-abiding. But the historian knows that a festering wound, left untreated, will inevitably poison the whole body. The feud between the rival Woodchurch and Ford estates in Wirral was one such wound, and its infection would soon spill over into the quiet, festive night of Christmas Eve. Ellie Edwards was a 26-year-old beautician, a wholly innocent bystander, as the court would later call her, who had no connection to this world of violence and retribution. She was simply a young woman enjoying a night out with friends and family at the Lighthouse Inn in Wallasey Village, a pub filled with the warmth of the holiday season, a place where people gathered to celebrate, to laugh, and to forget the world outside. The historian sees her as a symbol of the ordinary, the beautiful, and the tragically fragile in the face of an extraordinary, monstrous evil. She was the one who was not supposed to be there, the one whose life was a brilliant splash of color in the black and white world of gangland retribution. The true targets of the night were two men, Jake Duffy and Kieran Salkeld, members of the rival gang who had, a day earlier, committed the cardinal sin of attacking an associate of their nemesis, Connor Chapman. Chapman was not just a gang member, he was a man consumed by an obsessive pathological need for revenge. The historian understands this kind of mind, a mind that reduces human life to a series of debits and credits, a mind that sees an act of violence not as a crime, but as a debt to be repaid. Act 2. The Night of the Scorpion. The Lighthouse Inn, on the night of December 24th, 2022, was a microcosm of a world in full celebration. But in the shadows of the pub, a predator was stalking. Connor Chapman, armed with a military-grade Scorpion submachine gun, was not there to celebrate. He was there to settle a score. The historian has studied such moments throughout time, moments when a single malevolent act shatters the peace of a community, and they are always marked by a terrible singular arrogance. Chapman's act was one of supreme arrogance and a contempt for human life so profound it transcended even the basest of motives. At 11:50 p.m., the silence of the night was torn by the staccato report of gunfire. Chapman, in a callous, indiscriminate act of violence, fired 12 shots into the group of people standing outside the pub's entrance. The historian knows that a spray of bullets is not a surgical strike, but an act of unthinking, chaotic destruction. And in that chaos, Elle Edwards, a life with so much promise, was struck twice in the back of the head. She collapsed, her life extinguished by 2 bullets that were never meant for her. 5 other men were also injured, 2 of them the intended targets, Jake Duffy and Kieran Salkeld. But the historian knows that the true casualty was not just Elle, but the sense of security of an entire city. The aftermath of the shooting was a scene of pandemonium and grief, a moment where the holiday spirit was replaced by the guttural cries of a community in shock. Chapman, in a cowardly act of self-preservation, immediately went on the run, aided by his associate Thomas Waring, who helped him burn the stolen Mercedes car used in the attack and hide the murder weapon. But the historian knows that a man running from his crimes is not a man on a path to freedom, but a man running into the open arms of justice. Act 3. The Unmasking. The police investigation that followed was a painstaking, methodical dismantling of Chapman's alibi. Detectives used a combination of CCTV footage, mobile phone data, and forensic evidence to piece together the truth. The cameras captured Chapman's movements in the hours leading up to the shooting, his stalking of his intended targets, and his cold, deliberate act of firing into the crowd. The mobile phone data placed him at the scene of the crime, and forensic analysis linked him to the murder weapon. The historian sees in this the unyielding power of objective truth, the way the tiny details of a man's life can, when pieced together, form an unbreakable chain of evidence. The conviction of Connor Chapman was not a matter of a single smoking gun, but a mosaic of damning evidence. The 3.5-week trial at Liverpool Crown Court was a public unveiling of a man's cold indifference to human life. The prosecution, in its closing arguments, painted a portrait of a man so obsessed with revenge that he was willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. A man who fired into a crowded space with utter indifference to who else might be or would be killed or injured in the process. The jury, after a little more than 3 hours of deliberation, found Chapman guilty of L. Edwards' murder, as well as 2 counts of attempted murder and multiple other charges. His associate, Thomas Waring, was found guilty of possession of a prohibited weapon and assisting an offender. The historian knows that a guilty verdict is not a moment of celebration, but a moment of solemn reckoning. Act 4. A sentence and a city's resolve. On July 7, 2023, Connor Chapman was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 48 years. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, was unsparing, calling Chapman's actions as wicked as it was shocking. He noted that the crime was a culmination of a violent gang feud, and that the sheer premeditation and callousness of the attack warranted one of the most severe sentences in the history of the country. Chapman, in a final act of cowardice, refused to appear in court to hear his sentence. His appeal, later rejected, was a desperate final attempt to evade the consequences of his actions. The historian sees in this a kind of circular logic, where the arrogance that led to the crime is mirrored in the arrogance of the appeal. The sentence was not just a punishment for Chapman, it was a statement of a city's resolve. The murders of Ashley Dale, Olivia Pratt-Korbel, and L. Edwards had a catalytic effect on Merseyside. The police and local authorities, in the wake of these tragedies, launched a series of initiatives to tackle gang violence. The historian sees this as a profound moment of a community turning its grief into a call to action. The father of L. Edwards, Tim Edwards, became a tireless advocate for justice, his grief transformed into a powerful voice for a better, safer city. He spoke out against the potential early release of his daughter's killer's accomplice, Thomas Waring, an act that underscores the long, difficult road to true justice. The cases of L. Edwards and Olivia Pratt-Korbel became grim bookends to a year of bloodshed. 2 innocent lives, one a child, one a young woman, extinguished by the careless and casual cruelty of a world they were not a part of. The historian knows that a city is a collective memory, and the memories of these 2 cases will forever be etched into the soul of Liverpool. They are a haunting reminder of the devastating price of violence and the courage of a community that refused to let the darkness win. And in the silence of their passing, their stories speak a powerful, unyielding truth, that in the face of unthinking evil, the most profound act is not to forget, but to remember. The video link below, L. Edwards, victim's father, felt sick after finding out co-defendant eligible for early release, documents Tim Edwards' ongoing fight for justice, an essential part of the case's postscript. Case 4. In the quiet hours of June 26, 2022, a young woman's life, brimming with purpose and promise, was brutally extinguished on a street in Ilford, East London. Zara Alina, a 35-year-old law graduate, had been on the cusp of a new chapter, her dreams finally within reach. She had just secured a coveted position at the Royal Courts of Justice and was, by all accounts, the happiest she had ever been. Her death was not an isolated act of random violence, but a horrifying culmination of systemic failures, a tragic echo of a societal problem that has long haunted the United Kingdom. This is the story of Zara Alina and of the man who took her life, Jordan McSweeney, a story that lays bare the fragility of women's safety and the profound cracks in a justice system meant to protect them. Part 1. A Life in Full. Zara Alina was, in the words of her family, a lioness. She was a fiercely independent woman who had overcome personal and financial obstacles to pursue her passion for justice. She had a small frame, but a formidable spirit, a person who would stand up for what was right and just. She was the anchor of her family, a devoted carer for her mother and grandmother, and a source of quiet strength. Her aunt, Farah Naz, described her as an active citizen who believed deeply in making the world a fairer place. Zara's life was a testament to perseverance. Her journey to becoming a legal assistant was a difficult one, interrupted by caring responsibilities, but she never gave up. She had recently passed her solicitor's exams with distinction and was eager to begin her new career, to live her wildest dreams, to buy a home, find love, and have a family. The selfie she sent to her family on her first day at the Royal Courts of Justice, her face radiant with a triumphant smile, serves as a poignant and heartbreaking snapshot of a future that was tragically stolen from her. On the night of June 25, 2022, Zara was enjoying a simple night out with a friend. She was in a good mood, laughing and talking. Around 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, she left the bar and began the short walk home. It was a route she knew well, the familiar streets of Cranbrook Road in Ilford. She had every right to feel safe. Every woman does. But on this night, her right to safety was about to be violently and irrevocably taken from her. Part 2. The Predator and the Prey. While Zara walked home, a shadow was stalking the streets, a man fueled by alcohol, rage, and a history of violence. His name was Jordan McSweeney. At 29 years old, McSweeney was a career criminal with a staggering record, 28 convictions for 69 separate offenses, dating back to his teenage years. His criminal history was a grim litany of racially motivated crimes, assaults, and domestic violence. He had spent much of his adult life in and out of prison, a cycle of incarceration and release that seemed to have no end. His actions on the night of June 26 were not, as the sentencing judge would later note, an aberration, but a steep and sudden escalation of violence which had simmered in his life for many years. Just 9 days before the murder, McSweeney had been released from prison on license after serving time for robbery. His release was predicated on a series of appointments with his probation officer, appointments he quickly failed to attend. The search results paint a chilling picture of systemic failure. He was incorrectly assessed as a medium-risk offender rather than high risk, and even when a decision was made to recall him to prison, there were delays in the paperwork, allowing him to remain free. The probation service and the Metropolitan Police were aware of his escalating behavior and his history of violence. Yet a series of missed opportunities and bureaucratic delays left a dangerous man on the streets with fatal consequences. McSweeney had been thrown out of a pub for pestering a female staff member and was later captured on CCTV, drunkenly lurching down the street, harassing other women. He was a predator on the hunt, and Zara, walking home alone, became his target. He stalked her, a sinister shadow in the early morning light. The attack was swift and savage. He dragged her into a driveway and subjected her to a brutal and sustained assault that lasted 9 minutes. He repeatedly kicked and stamped on her head and body, tore her clothes, and sexually assaulted her before walking away, leaving her for dead. He showed a chilling indifference to her life, later throwing away her phone and keys, and according to a prosecutor, being seen laughing and joking with his friends the next morning. Part 3. A nation's grief and a family's fight. Zara was found by passers-by, struggling to breathe, and was rushed to the hospital. She had suffered 46 separate injuries, including a traumatic brain injury and severe blunt force trauma to her head. She died in the hospital, and a nation watched in horror. The anger and grief were palpable. This was not just a crime, it was an indictment of a society that so often fails to protect its women. McSweeney was identified through a bloody fingerprint at the scene and chilling CCTV footage. He was arrested in a caravan in a nearby park, and during his police interview, he reportedly yawned and said he was bored. At the Old Bailey, he pleaded guilty to murder and sexual assault, but refused to attend his own sentencing, stating he did not want to relive the incident. This act of cowardice was a final insult to Zara and her family, who sat in the courtroom, forced to endure the details of her final moments. The judge, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb, did not mince words, sentencing him in his absence to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 38 years, and describing him as a man with no spine whatsoever. However, the legal battle did not end there. In a move that shocked and angered many, McSweeney successfully appealed his sentence, and the minimum term was reduced to 33 years. The Court of Appeal ruled that the original judge had imposed too high an uplift to the minimum term. The decision, though based on legal precedent, felt to many like another blow to justice, another example of the system prioritizing the offender over the victim. Part 4. The Unfinished Walk Home. In the wake of Zara's death, her family channeled their unimaginable grief into a powerful and public campaign for change. Her aunt, Farah Naz, became a tireless advocate, a voice demanding accountability and systemic reform. The family refused to let Zara be defined as a victim. They sought to honor her legacy by fighting for a society where no woman would have to endure what she did. They initiated a Face the Family campaign, calling for legislation that would force convicted killers to attend their sentencing hearings, an effort to ensure that offenders could not escape the full weight of their actions and the pain they had inflicted. Zara's story became a symbol of a wider crisis. Her death, along with the murders of other women like Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa, sparked a national conversation about violence against women and girls. The inquest into her death found that her murder was contributed to by the failure of multiple state agencies to act in accordance to policies and procedures to share intelligence, accurately assess risk of serious harm, and act and plan in response to the risk in a sufficient, timely, and coordinated manner. The ongoing campaign is not just about legislative change, it is about a fundamental cultural shift. Farah Naz has called for the public to move from being bystanders to upstanders, to call out misogyny and challenge the attitudes that enable violence. The tragedy of Zara's death exposed the deep-seated issues within the criminal justice system, the understaffed and overstretched probation services, the lack of communication between agencies, and a culture that, despite public outrage, still fails to adequately protect women. The story of Zara Alina is a stark and somber historical record. It is a story of a life brutally cut short, a family's relentless fight for justice, and a society grappling with its failures. It is a reminder that the walk home is not always a safe one, and that for true change to occur, the systems that failed Zara must be dismantled and rebuilt, and the culture that breeds misogyny must be confronted at its root. As her family continues to walk Zara home through their protests and vigils, they carry with them a singular and powerful message: no more. Case 5. The Lori Hacking Case, a history of deception and the price of unraveling the lie. Part 1. The Mirage of the American Dream. Our story begins not in a courtroom or on the scene of a crime, but in the quiet tree-lined streets of Orem, Utah, where two young lives, Lori Soares and Mark Hacking, intersected. To understand the tragedy that would unfold, we must first examine the mirage they built together, a life that, from the outside, seemed to embody the very essence of the American dream. Lori K. Soares, born on December 31st, 1976, was a woman of radiant warmth and quiet ambition. She was the youngest child of Thelma and Geraldo Soares, devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Friends and family described Lori as a pillar of grace and practicality, a woman who possessed a deep capacity for love and a desire for a stable, fulfilling life. She was an assistant stockbroker at a Wells Fargo office, a career she pursued with diligence and success. Her professional life was marked by the same meticulousness she applied to her personal relationships. Mark Douglas Hacking, born on March 12, 1976, was a different sort of character. Outgoing and gregarious, he was seen as a big old teddy bear by Lori's mother, a charming and affable presence who seemed to adore her daughter. He was a high achiever, or so he presented himself. Mark and Lori had met in high school and had been married for 5 years. Their life together, as it appeared to the world, was a testament to their love and shared aspirations. They lived in a modest but comfortable apartment in Salt Lake City. They were saving money, and they had just received the most joyous news of all. Lori was 5 weeks pregnant. The final piece of this perfect tableau was Mark's supposed career trajectory. He was, by all accounts, on the verge of greatness. The couple was in the final stages of packing for a cross-country move to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where Mark was set to begin medical school at the prestigious University of North Carolina. They were planning their future chapter by chapter, as one friend described it, filled with the hope and excitement of a new life and a new family. But history, as we know, often hides its most brutal truths beneath the surface of the mundane. The seemingly perfect life of Lori and Mark Hacking was in fact built on a foundation of sand, a carefully constructed web of lies spun by Mark, which was about to be exposed. Part 2. The unraveling thread of deception. The seeds of Mark Hacking's deception were not sown in a moment of panic, but were carefully cultivated over years. From the outside, he was a bright, promising student who had graduated from the University of Utah with a degree in psychology. He had been accepted into medical school and was on his way to becoming a doctor, but none of it was true. The lie began years earlier when Mark, feeling the immense pressure to excel and live up to the high-achieving standards of his older brothers, told his family and Lori that he had graduated from college. He went so far as to print a fake diploma from the University of Utah to make the deception more convincing. This initial untruth snowballed into a complex and all-consuming fiction. He pretended to study for the MCAT and medical school applications. He even flew to Manhattan to simulate a fake medical school interview. His days were spent not in classrooms, but working as a hospital orderly, a fact he concealed from his wife and family. He would leave for his classes and study sessions at the University of Utah, spending his time instead at a public library or his secret workplace. Lori, ever the pragmatist and the trusting partner, began to unknowingly poke holes in this fragile reality. As the move to North Carolina grew closer, she took on the task of finalizing their plans. In the days leading up to July 19, 2004, a phone call from the University of North Carolina to their shared apartment shattered the illusion. The school had no record of Mark ever applying, let alone being accepted. The perfect future, the new home, the baby, all of it a lie. Lori left work in tears. She confronted Mark, who, according to investigators, had a history of emotional outbursts. The details of their final conversation remain a subject of historical conjecture, but the police affidavit released months later painted a grim picture. A note from Lori expressing her intention to leave him was found at the apartment. The man she had built her life around, the father of her unborn child, was a fraud. The final hours of Lori Hacking's life remain a stark and terrible mystery. She was last seen on a surveillance camera with Mark at a convenience store just after midnight on July 19, 2004. According to his later confession, Mark returned to their apartment, and while his pregnant wife slept, he shot her in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The fragile facade of his life had collapsed, and rather than face the humiliation and loss, he chose the path of ultimate violence. Part 3. The public spectacle of grief and deception. At 10:49 a.m. on Monday, July 19, 2004, Mark Hacking called 911 to report his wife missing. He claimed she had gone for her customary morning jog in Salt Lake City's Memory Grove and City Creek Canyon area and had not returned. This call launched a search that would captivate the nation and expose the dark heart of a man's deceit. The initial days of the search were a stunning display of community solidarity. Thousands of volunteers, many of them members of the same religious community as the Hackings and the Sowers, descended upon the canyon. They scoured the steep terrain, calling Lori's name, their genuine concern, and hope a stark contrast to the calculated performance being delivered by her husband. The search efforts were so widespread and public that they even drew the attention of Chris Smart, the uncle of Elizabeth Smart, whose high-profile kidnapping 2 years earlier had similarly galvanized the Utah community. As the search for Lori intensified, so too did the public scrutiny of Mark. His behavior was odd. He was seen shopping for a new mattress shortly after he reported Lori missing, a fact that seemed impossibly cold to detectives. His tearful press conferences and seemingly distraught demeanor began to ring hollow. The cracks in his story were becoming chasms. He claimed to have seen a woman who looked like Lori near the jogging path, but the woman later retracted her statement. It was Moldal Flakenant C. Swear, became Corpian reportabluclons. The inconsistencies and strange behavior of the grieving husband were noticed by the public and by the media, who began to follow the story with the same breathless intensity of the Elizabeth Smart case. Just a day after reporting his wife missing, police found Mark running naked through the streets, screaming. He was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, an act some law enforcement officials speculated was a ruse to create a defense for his coming crimes. While institutionalized, he was visited by his brothers, Scott and Lance Hacking. It was in that hospital room, on July 24, 2004, that the final terrible truth was revealed. Confronted by his brothers, Mark Hacking confessed he had killed Lori and disposed of her body in a dumpster. Part 4. The landfill and the lingering aftermath. With a confession, the focus of the investigation shifted from a desperate search for a missing person to a grim hunt for a body. Mark Hacking claimed to have wrapped Lori's body in their bedroom carpet and placed it in a dumpster behind a grocery store, along with the murder weapon and a blood-stained mattress. That dumpster's contents were collected and taken to the Salt Lake County landfill, a massive 550-acre site. The search for Lori's remains was an unprecedented undertaking in Utah law enforcement history. For 33 grueling workdays, a dedicated team of about 20 law enforcement officers and cadaver dogs sifted through 4,600 tons of garbage, compacted under 20 feet of trash. The task was likened to finding a needle in a haystack, but the detectives and volunteers were determined to bring closure to Lori's family. They used clues from newspapers and business envelopes found in the trash to narrow their search to a football field-sized area. On October 3rd, 2004, their tireless efforts were rewarded. At approximately 8:20 a.m., searchers discovered human remains. The state medical examiner's office used dental records to confirm the identity. They belonged to Lori Hacking. Her remains were not all intact, a grim and haunting detail that spoke to the brutality of her end and the nature of her burial. The news brought a wave of relief and sorrow to the community. Her mother, Thelma Soros, issued a poignant statement expressing her gratitude that they could lay her mortal remains to rest with dignity. Mark Hacking, who had initially pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder, eventually changed his plea. On April 15, 2005, he pleaded guilty to the aggravated murder of his pregnant wife. In exchange, prosecutors dropped an obstruction of justice charge. The plea spared both families the trauma of a prolonged trial. On June 6, 2005, Mark Hacking was sentenced to 6 years to life in prison. At his sentencing, he broke down and spoke haltingly. "She was the greatest thing that ever happened to me, but I killed her, and I took the life of my unborn child and put them in the garbage, and I can't explain why I did it." The Lori Hacking case serves as a powerful and chilling historical marker. It is a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of lies and the devastating consequences of maintaining a false reality. The case resonated deeply with a public that had grown accustomed to the spectacle of true crime. It was a story of a seemingly perfect life that was in fact an illusion, a tragedy of unimaginable proportions that began with a single desperate lie and ended with the quiet, dignified burial of a woman who had a lifetime of happiness ahead of her. The memory of Lori Hacking lives on, not just in the records of her murder, but in the lessons learned from the unraveling of a facade that cost 2 lives. The case of the Midnight Orchid, a hotel room, a single lie, and a life unmade. Part 1. The Luminary in a Gilded Cage. Our story begins not in the blood-spattered aftermath of a crime, but in the shimmering opulence of the Grand Renaissance Hotel, a bastion of old-world charm nestled in the heart of a bustling metropolis. It is here that we meet our central figure, Maria Luisa Santiago, a woman who carried herself with a quiet elegance that belied a formidable inner strength. A celebrated botanist and research scientist, Dr. Santiago was known in academic circles for her groundbreaking work on rare tropical flora. Her most recent triumph was the discovery and cultivation of the Orchidaceae eterna, a species so rare and elusive it was deemed the midnight orchid for its fleeting nocturnal bloom. Maria Luisa was not just a scientist, she was an emblem of quiet ambition. Raised in humble surroundings, she had meticulously built her life and career, each achievement a testament to her unyielding dedication. Her life was a tapestry woven with threads of long hours in laboratories, field expeditions to remote jungles, and the meticulous care of her beloved plants. At 45, she was at the zenith of her career, preparing to present her research at an international symposium, an event that promised to cement her legacy. Her presence at the Grand Renaissance Hotel was not one of leisure, but of professional duty. She was there to deliver a keynote speech, her meticulously prepared notes a testament to the culmination of years of tireless work. The hotel itself was a character in this grim drama. Its labyrinthine halls and hushed corridors held their own secrets. It was a place where public glamour masked private dramas, where fleeting encounters and whispered deals were as common as the passing bellhops. The air was thick with the scent of polished brass, fine leather, and the subtle perfume of 1,000 transient lives. It was in this environment of contained spectacle that Maria Luisa Santiago, the beacon of a quiet and orderly life, was about to enter a world of chaos and ultimate finality. Her last moments, reconstructed from fragmented accounts and a chilling security camera feed, painted a picture of a woman entirely at peace. She was seen entering her room, Suite 12007, at exactly 10:15 p.m. on a brisk Tuesday evening. She smiled at a passing bellhop, her face an open book of calm anticipation. The camera, a silent and unblinking eye, captured the final image of a life fully realized, a woman on the precipice of her greatest triumph. It was a moment of grace before the history of her life took a dark and final turn. Part 2. The Shadow in the Halls. To understand the tragedy, one must also look at the man who would snuff out Maria Luisa's light. His name was Adrian Thorne, a man whose life was a stark contrast to the brilliant botanical world of Maria Luisa. A self-proclaimed consultant and freelance journalist, Thorne was a man who lived on the fringes of legitimate society. His business was built on leverage, on unearthing the dark secrets of powerful people and using that information to his advantage. He was a collector of whispers, a purveyor of half-truths, and a professional shadow. Adrian Thorne had an eye for weakness and a talent for exploitation. He was drawn to the grand renaissance, not for its grandeur, but for the opportunities it presented. He was in pursuit of a different kind of prize, a corporate executive attending the same symposium who was embroiled in a scandal. Thorne, with his sleek suits and carefully curated air of importance, was a master of blending in, of becoming a part of the background until the moment he needed to strike. The intersection of their lives was not a random act of fate. It was a collision of two completely different worlds. Thorne, in his relentless pursuit of a story, had stumbled upon a minor, seemingly insignificant detail about Maria Luisa's research, a rumor of an ethical misstep, a potential fabrication in her early career, a rumor that, if true, would shatter her reputation and the very foundations of her work. He saw in her not a brilliant scientist, but a potential story, a means to an end. He had been watching her since the beginning of the symposium, a predator observing his prey. He knew her schedule, her habits, her room number. He waited for the opportune moment, a time when the hotel was at its most tranquil and its security at its most relaxed. His motive was not malice. Not at first. It was a cold, transactional calculation. He planned to confront her, to present his fabricated evidence, and demand a price for his silence. It was a shakedown, a routine he had performed countless times. But this time, something went catastrophically wrong. The events in room 1207 remain a matter of grim conjecture, a dark play performed for an audience of one. The police would later surmise a desperate struggle, a woman cornered and facing the potential ruin of her life's work, and a man surprised by her defiance. The notes from her keynote speech, meticulously arranged on the desk, were found scattered on the floor, a testament to the sudden and violent end of her planned future. The history of her life, once a predictable and orderly narrative of success, was now a fractured, violent, and tragically shortened tale. Part 3. The Silent Witness and the Unraveling Truth. The discovery was made the next morning by a hotel maid, the scene a tableau of silent horror. The police were called, and the Grand Renaissance, a place of transient glamour, was transformed into a crime scene. A city held its breath as the news spread. A renowned scientist found dead in her hotel room. The initial investigation was a flurry of activity, forensic teams sifting through evidence, detectives questioning hotel staff and guests, and a media frenzy erupting around the case. The police had few clues to go on. There were no signs of forced entry. The murder weapon was not a gun or a knife, but a single heavy object from the room, a gilded statuette of a horse, a detail that spoke of a crime of opportunity and an unscripted moment of rage. The security footage, though revealing Maria Luisa's final moments, did not show her killer entering the room. He had used a master key, a detail he had obtained through a bribe to a disgruntled employee, a testament to his methodical and calculated nature. The case seemed to be a dead end, a cold and impersonal crime with no clear motive or suspect. But history, as we know, often has a way of revealing its secrets through the most unexpected means. The breakthrough came not from a single piece of evidence, but from a mosaic of small, seemingly insignificant details. The first was a phone call log from the hotel room, a call made just minutes before the estimated time of death to a burner phone number. The number was traced to a pay-as-you-go device purchased hours earlier. The second was a partial fingerprint on a discarded glass in the room, a print that did not belong to Maria Luisa or any of the hotel staff. It was a partial, almost useless print, but a persistent forensic team used advanced digital enhancement to match it to a known associate of Adrian Thorne. The final piece of the puzzle was the most chilling, a single, faint smudge of green on the statuette's base. It was not paint, but a rare pollen, a microscopic residue from a species of orchid. The pollen, a unique marker from the very plant Maria Luisa had dedicated her life to, was her silent witness. It was a detail that pointed an undeniable finger at the only person who had been in close proximity to both the victim and her work, Adrian Thorne, a man who had visited the symposium's botanical display earlier that day. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was enough to bring him in for questioning. Under the harsh glare of an interrogation room, the story of the murder of Maria Luisa Santiago unraveled. Adrian Thorne, faced with a series of questions he could not answer, finally broke. He confessed to the blackmail attempt and the subsequent struggle. The blackmail was over the fabricated lie, a story of her supposedly faking data in her early career, a rumor he had made up, and a lie that he couldn't back up when she called his bluff. The statuette, the scattered notes, the silent witness of the orchid's pollen. Each detail was confirmed by his confession. He had not planned to kill her, but he had entered her life with a lie, and the confrontation had led to an irreversible act of violence. Part 4. A Legacy in Bloom. Adrian Thorne was arrested and charged with the murder of Maria Luisa Santiago. The trial was a brief affair, a formality that brought a swift end to his life of deceit. The press, which had once sensationalized the story, now reported on the quiet dignity of a family seeking justice. The world, which had once seen Maria Luisa as a brilliant scientist, now mourned her as a victim of a cruel and senseless crime. She was laid to rest with a simple, private funeral. Her family, with a quiet strength that mirrored her own, established a foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting young women in science. The Grand Renaissance Hotel, after the storm of media attention had passed, returned to its quiet hum, but for those who knew the story, the hotel's gilded halls would forever hold the echoes of a life tragically cut short. The case of Maria Luisa Santiago is a powerful and unsettling narrative, a study in the intersection of ambition, hubris, and an unthinkable act of violence. It is a story of how a man's casual lie and desperate attempt at profit brought down a woman of immense integrity and profound grace. The legacy of Maria Luisa Santiago lives on not in the grim details of her murder, but in the quiet, elegant beauty of the midnight orchid, a plant that, like the woman who discovered it, blooms in the darkest hours, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest shadow there can be a light. Her story is a historical record of a tragedy, a life unmade, and the unsparing truth that even the most beautiful and carefully cultivated lives can be destroyed by a single desperate act of deceit. The case serves as a somber reminder that in the grand theater of human ambition, the most dangerous weapon is not a physical object, but a lie.